My phone rang at 2:14 in the morning, and the second I heard my granddaughter's voice, I knew something was wrong. "Grandma," Sophie whispered, so quiet I had to press the phone hard against my ear in the dark. "Grandma, he hit my mom." I didn't ask questions. I didn't waste a single second being shocked, even ripped straight out of sleep like that. 26 years as an ER nurse had trained one instinct into me deeper than fear ever could. When someone tells you something is happening right now, you move first and process later. "Sophie, baby, listen to me carefully," I said, already throwing back the covers, already reaching for my car keys in the dark. "Are you somewhere safe?" She was in her closet, door locked, phone on silent except for me. I told her I was coming. I told her to stay exactly where she was. And then I hung up, called 911 with hands that were somehow completely steady despite the hour, and got in my car at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, my whole street still asleep behind their dark windows. What Brad didn't know, sitting in that house thinking he'd just had a bad night that would blow over by morning the way it always had before, was that he had just made the last mistake of his entire comfortable, well-respected life. And if you've ever had to become someone's safety in the middle of their worst night, you already know there's no version of this story where I just go back to sleep after that call. So stick with me, hit subscribe if you're new here, and tell me where you're watching from, because I read every single comment. My name is Margaret Doyle. Everyone's called me Maggie since nursing school, 40 years ago now, and for most of my life, I believed I was good at reading people. 26 years working in emergency room in Richmond will do that to you. You learn to spot the lie under the explanation, the flinch under the smile, faster than most people learn anything at all. I want you to understand that, because it makes what happened with my own daughter sting in a particular way that I still haven't fully made peace with. Rachel met Brad Connors when she was 27 at a mutual friend's wedding in Charlottesville. She called me the next morning, practically breathless. "Mom, I think I just met someone," she said, and I could hear her smiling through the phone. Brad was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of man you'd want your daughter to bring home. He worked in finance, did well without being flashy about it. He opened doors, remembered birthdays, sent flowers to Rachel's office for no occasion at all, just because, he said, he'd been thinking about her. At their wedding, 2 years later, he gave a toast that had half the room in tears, talking about how Rachel had taught him what it meant to actually be present in a relationship instead of just performing one. I cried at that wedding, too. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I wasn't performing happiness for the sake of the day. I genuinely believed, standing there in my mother-of-the-bride dress, that my daughter had found something rare and good. For the first few years, nothing gave me any real reason to doubt that. They bought a beautiful house outside Richmond, the kind with a wraparound porch Rachel had always dreamed about as a little girl. Sophie was born when Rachel was 31, and Brad seemed, by every account I had, to be a doting father. Coaching her t-ball team, building her an elaborate dollhouse over an entire winter, the kind of father who shows up at school events early and stays late. I tell you all of this not to make you like Brad before I tell you the rest. I tell you this because I think it's important to understand exactly how convincing he was, how completely the picture he built around my daughter's life could pass any inspection, including, for longer than I'm proud to admit, my own. There was, however, one thing that nagged at me almost from the beginning, small enough that I talked myself out of it more times than I can count. Brad had a way of correcting Rachel in public that I never quite warmed to. Nothing dramatic, never raised voices, never anything you could point to and call cruel outright. Just small, precise corrections, delivered with a smile, the kind that made Rachel laugh it off every time. "That's not quite how it happened, babe," he'd say, mid-story, taking over the rest of the telling himself. Or, at a dinner party once, when Rachel mentioned she might go back to finish her teaching certification, Brad had laughed warmly and said, "She says that every year. I think she just likes the idea of it more than the reality." And the table had laughed along, and Rachel had laughed too. A half beat too quickly, the way you laugh when you're agreeing to be smaller than you actually are. I noticed those moments. I want to be honest and say that I noticed them every single time, the same sharp instinct that had served me for decades in triage rooms, quietly flagging something underneath the surface of my own daughter's marriage. But I also did something I've spent a great deal of time since then trying to forgive myself for. I talked myself out of trusting that instinct, over and over, because the alternative, actually confronting what I suspected, felt disproportionate to the small, deniable evidence I actually had. He's just a strong personality. She's just letting him have his moment. It's not my place to read into a joke at a dinner party. I told myself that for almost 6 years. And the entire time, Sophie was growing up, in that house, learning, the way children do without anyone meaning to teach them, exactly what it looked like when someone you love made themselves smaller and smaller in order to keep the peace. Looking back now, I can trace a clear line of small, deniable moments across those 6 years, the kind of evidence that means nothing on its own, and everything once you finally let yourself line it all up in a row. Rachel started calling less, somewhere around Sophie's 3rd birthday. Not dramatically less, just enough that I noticed. The way you notice a clock running a few minutes slow. Never quite enough to be sure until you compare it against something else. Our Sunday calls, which we'd kept up religiously since she left for college, started shifting to texts instead. "Things are just so busy right now, Mom. I'll call this weekend." The weekend call would come, eventually, but shorter than it used to be, with Brad's voice occasionally audible somewhere in the background, and Rachel's own voice subtly adjusting whenever it was. There was a Christmas, Sophie's first, when Rachel showed up to my house with a faint bruise along her forearm, mostly hidden under a long sleeve, visible only when she reached up to hang her coat. "Tripped on the porch steps carrying the diaper bag," she said, before I'd even asked, which struck me, even then, as strange. Answering a question I hadn't gotten around to voicing yet. I let it go. I told myself new mother's trip carrying diaper bags all the time. I'd done it myself once, with Rachel, years before. There was a dinner, maybe 2 years after that, when Rachel mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd stopped seeing her college roommate Lauren as often. "We just grew apart," she said, in a tone that didn't quite match the sentence, the way people sound when they're repeating an explanation they've practiced rather than one they actually believe. I found out much later, far too much later, that Lauren had simply asked Rachel one too many direct questions about Brad, and Brad had quietly made it clear, in his particular way, that he found Lauren a bad influence on Rachel's mood. One by one, over those years, Rachel's closest friendships thinned out the same way. Not through any single dramatic event, just a slow, patient narrowing, the kind that's almost impossible to point to as abuse from the outside, because it never looks like force. It looks like a woman quietly choosing, again and again, to let go of the people who might ask her hard questions, in favor of keeping the peace at home. I missed it. I want to say that plainly without softening it, because I think the softened version of this story is the more dangerous one. I was a trained ER nurse who had spent decades learning to spot the signs of abuse in strangers brought through our doors at 3 a.m. Defensive injuries, inconsistent explanations, partners who insisted on answering every question themselves. I knew the pattern cold in a clinical setting. I simply could not make myself see it in my own daughter's kitchen, eating Christmas dinner off my own good china, because the alternative was too enormous to hold. There was one conversation, about a year before that 2 a.m. phone call. that I think about more than any other now. Rachel and I were alone in my kitchen, Brad off somewhere with Sophie, and out of nowhere, washing a dish she didn't need to wash, she said very quietly, not quite looking at me. Do you ever worry you made the wrong choice with Dad? Before he passed, I mean. Do you ever wonder if you should have left sooner, even though it all worked out eventually? It was such a strange, specific question that I remember being caught off guard by it. Her father, my husband Tom, had been a difficult, controlling man for the first decade of our marriage, before years of counseling and his own hard-won self-awareness had genuinely changed him into someone gentler, before cancer eventually took him far too young. I'd told Rachel some of that history, in pieces over the years. The way you tell your grown daughter the complicated truths of your own marriage once she's old enough to hold them. I think about it sometimes. I told her honestly that day. I think the version of your father I married wasn't the version who raised you, and I'm grateful every day that he changed. But Rachel, if I'm honest, there were years I should have left. I stayed because I kept believing it would get better on its own, without me having to do anything hard about it. It eventually did get better, but I got lucky, sweetheart. Not every story like that has the same ending. She nodded slowly, drying that one dish for far longer than the task required, and then changed the subject entirely, asking about a recipe, and I let her change it because I didn't yet understand what she'd actually been asking me. I understand it now. I've understood it with a clarity that still makes my chest ache since 2:14 in the morning on a Tuesday, almost exactly 1 year after that conversation in my kitchen, when my granddaughter's whispered voice on the phone finally connected every small, deniable moment I'd spent 6 years quietly explaining away. I'd gone to bed around 11 that Tuesday night, the way I did most nights since retiring. A cup of chamomile tea, the late local news playing low in the background, asleep before the weather segment most evenings. I don't know what woke me first, exactly. Whether it was the phone itself or some older instinct, the kind you never fully lose after decades of being on call. But I was awake and reaching for my nightstand before the second ring finished. Sophie. Her name lit up the screen at 2:14 in the morning, and every cell in my body went cold and clear at once, the same particular focus I used to feel walking into a trauma bay. Sophie? I answered, already sitting up, already swinging my legs out of bed. For a moment there was nothing but breathing, fast and shallow, the unmistakable sound of a child trying very hard not to cry loud enough to be heard through a wall. "Grandma," she finally whispered, so quiet I had to press the phone hard against my ear in the dark room. "Grandma, he hit my mom. I want to tell you what went through my mind in that exact second because I think it surprised even me. It wasn't panic, not yet. It was something colder and more useful than panic. Every instinct from 26 years of emergency medicine snapping into a kind of focus I hadn't needed in years. "Okay, sweetheart, I'm here," I said, keeping my voice as level and steady as I could make it, the same voice I used to use on frightened patients. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to be so brave for just a few more minutes." "Can you do that for me?" "Yes," she breathed. "Where are you right now?" "My closet." I locked the door. Something in my chest both broke and steadied at the exact same moment. Broke, because my 10-year-old granddaughter had clearly rehearsed this, somewhere in her mind, long before that night, knowing exactly where to go and what to lock. Steadied because she had done it. She'd kept herself safe. "Good girl," I said. "That was exactly right, Sophie. You did exactly the right thing." "Is your phone on silent?" "Yes." "Keep it that way. Don't hang up with me, but if anyone tries to open that door, I need you to put the phone down low and quiet, okay? Can you hear anything right now? Is anyone near you?" "I can hear them downstairs," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mom's crying. He's yelling about, I don't know, Grandma. I don't know what happened. I just heard a loud noise, and then Mom was crying really hard, and I heard him say something, and then I just ran. You did perfectly, I told her, already up, already moving through my dark bedroom toward the closet, where I kept a pair of shoes by the door for exactly this kind of unplanned urgency, a habit left over from decades of being on call. I am so proud of you for getting somewhere safe. I'm getting in my car right now, and I'm calling some other people who can help too, and I am going to be there as fast as I possibly can. Can you stay right where you are and stay on the phone with me? Okay, she said, and I could hear, even through the whisper, some small fraction of her fear settling, just slightly, now that she wasn't carrying it entirely alone anymore. I got dressed in the dark, in under 90 seconds, the phone wedged between my shoulder and my ear, years of muscle memory from middle-of-the-night hospital callbacks taking over completely. I grabbed my car keys, my purse, and on a sudden, sharp instinct I didn't fully examine in the moment, my old digital recorder from my nightstand drawer. The one I used to use for dictating patient notes, kept charged out of nothing but habit for years after I'd actually needed it for work. I called 911 on my second phone, while Sophie stayed on the line with my first. My hands somehow completely steady despite my heart hammering harder than it had in years, giving the dispatcher Rachel's address, explaining as clearly and calmly as I could exactly what my granddaughter had just told me, requesting officers be sent immediately to a domestic disturbance in progress. Ma'am, can you stay on the line until units arrive? The dispatcher asked. I'm already in my car, I told her, backing out of my driveway into the empty sleeping street, the porch lights of my neighbors' houses the only thing lit for blocks. I'll be there in 11 minutes. Tell the officers I'll be the gray Honda pulling up right behind them. I drove those 11 minutes faster than I'd driven anything. In 30 years, Sophie's whispered, breathing still on the line in my other ear. Both of us holding on to each other through nothing but sound across the dark, empty highway between us, and somewhere in that drive, I made a decision, quietly, completely, that I would carry through everything that came after. Whatever happened in that house tonight, I was never again going to let myself explain away a single thing I saw with my own 2 eyes. I pulled up to find a single patrol car already in the driveway, its lights washing blue and red across the front of that beautiful house with the wraparound porch Rachel had dreamed about as a little girl. I was out of my car before I'd even fully put it in park. Sophie still whispering to me through the phone in my hand. Sophie, baby, I'm here. I'm right outside. I'm coming in. An officer stopped me at the front walk, young, careful, doing exactly what he was trained to do. Ma'am, I need you to stay back for just a moment. We're assessing the scene. I'm the grandmother, I said, holding up my phone like it was a badge of its own. My granddaughter's been on the line with me this whole time. She's in a locked closet upstairs, second door on the left. My daughter is somewhere in there, and she may be hurt. I was an emergency room nurse for 26 years, officer, and I am not going to be a problem for you. But I am also not going to stand on this lawn while my daughter and granddaughter are inside that house. Something in my voice must have carried the exact mix of authority and restraint I intended, because he glanced at his partner, then nodded once. Stay behind me. Let us clear the room first. They found Brad in the kitchen, agitated but not violent in that moment, already talking fast, already explaining. They found Rachel in the living room, sitting very still on the edge of the couch, one hand pressed against her face, the kind of stillness I recognized instantly from decades of trauma intake. The particular quiet of someone whose body has gone into careful self-preservation mode, conserving every bit of energy for whatever comes next. I went to her the moment the officers gave the all clear, kneeling in front of her the way I used to kneel in front of frightened patients, putting myself at her eye level instead of looming over her. I'm here, I said quietly. I've got you. Sophie's safe, she's still upstairs. An officer's gone up to get her right now. You don't have to explain anything to me yet. I just need you to let me look at you for a second, okay? Can you do that? She nodded barely and let me gently turn her face toward the light. I won't describe in detail what I saw. I don't think it serves this story to dwell there, and I don't think Rachel would want me to, even now, telling this. I'll say only that 26 years in an emergency room had shown me enough injuries to know, immediately and without question, exactly what I was looking at. And that some clinical, steady part of me cataloged it precisely, calmly, the way I'd been trained to, even as the mother in me wanted nothing more than to scream. I'm so sorry, Rachel whispered, the words coming out broken, half-formed. I'm so sorry you had to see this. I'm so sorry Sophie had to call you. I should have. Don't, I said, taking both her hands in mine, firm enough that she had to look at me. Don't you dare apologize to me right now. You did nothing wrong tonight. Do you understand me? Nothing. The only person in this house who did something wrong is in that kitchen right now. A second officer came down the stairs with Sophie a few minutes later, my granddaughter's face blotchy from crying, but her eyes finding mine instantly across the room. The particular relief of a child finally allowed to stop being brave all by herself. She ran to me, and I caught her, and for just a moment, holding both my granddaughter against my side while keeping Rachel's hand in mine, I let myself feel, fully, exactly how close I had come to losing both of them to a slow, quiet erosion I'd spent 6 years explaining away. Then I straightened my back, because there was still work to do that night, and grief was a luxury I hadn't yet earned the right to fully feel. Ma'am, the first officer said quietly, approaching me again, we're going to need a statement from your daughter, and we'll likely be placing your son-in-law under arrest tonight, based on what we're seeing here and what your granddaughter reported. Is there somewhere safe you can take them both? They're coming home with me, I said before Rachel could even open her mouth to answer. Tonight, and for as long as they need. I looked past the officer's shoulder, into the kitchen, where Brad stood with his hands cuffed behind his back, still talking, still explaining, his voice carrying that same smooth, reasonable tone he'd used at dinner parties for 6 years to make my daughter laugh off things that were never actually funny. For the first time in longer than I could remember, nobody in that room was laughing along with him at all. I watched him work the room the entire time the officers were finishing up, and I understood, with a clarity that almost frightened me, exactly how he'd managed to fool everyone, including me, for 6 years. Officers, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding, Brad said, his voice perfectly calm, perfectly reasonable, the exact tone he used to smooth over Rachel's stories at dinner parties. My wife and I had an argument. It got heated. I would never put my hands on her. I think she may have hurt herself trying to get away from me during the argument, honestly, and I understand how that looks, but... Sir, your daughter-in-law's injuries and your daughter's account are consistent with each other, the older officer said evenly, clearly not the first time he'd heard a version of this particular speech. We'll let the investigation sort out the details. Brad's eyes found mine across the room, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly. Not fear exactly, more like recalculation. The look of a man realizing the audience he was performing for had just changed. Maggie, he said. Softer now, almost wounded. You know me. You've known me for 8 years. You know I would never. I know exactly what I just saw in your living room, I said. And I kept my voice as level as I'd kept it on the phone with Sophie, because I understood, even in that moment, that losing my composure was exactly what he needed from me. A hysterical mother-in-law to dismiss, rather than a calm witness to be afraid of. And I know my granddaughter called me at 2 a.m. because she's known, for longer than any of us realized, exactly how to keep herself safe in her own house. Children don't learn that by accident, Brad. He didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in 8 years, I watched him search for the smooth, reasonable thing to say next, and find nothing. The officers placed him under arrest. A few minutes later, on charges I won't list in detail here, except to say they were serious enough that he spent the rest of that night somewhere other than the beautiful house with the wraparound porch. As they walked him out to the patrol car, he called back over his shoulder, to Rachel this time, his voice cracking in a way I recognized instantly. Not genuine remorse, but the particular performance of remorse that's designed to land on a victim's guilt rather than a witness's clarity. "Rachel, baby, I'm so sorry. We'll figure this out. I love you. I love Sophie." Rachel didn't answer him. She sat very still on that couch, my hands still wrapped around hers, and watched the patrol car doors close on the man she'd spent 8 years quietly explaining away to herself, the same way I'd spent 6 years explaining him away, too. It was Sophie, small and fierce in a way that broke my heart and made me fiercely proud all at once, who finally spoke into the silence after the car pulled away. "I'm not sad he's gone," she said quietly, her voice steady in a way no 10-year-old's voice should ever have to be steady about something like that. "I just wish I'd called you sooner, Grandma." I pulled her into my side, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, and I made her a promise in that moment that I intended to keep with everything I had left in me. "You called me exactly when you needed to," I told her, "and I promise you both, right now, this is the last night either of you ever has to be afraid in your own house again. Whatever it takes." I didn't know yet, sitting in that living room at nearly 4 in the morning, exactly how far I was going to have to go to keep that promise. But I already understood, with the same clear, clinical certainty I'd carried into that house, that I was not going to let this end with a single night in jail and a quiet plea deal 6 months later. Brad had spent 8 years building a comfortable, well-respected life on the careful belief that no one was watching closely enough to see what was actually happening underneath it. He had just found out, in the worst possible way, exactly how wrong he'd been. I let Rachel and Sophie sleep most of that first day at my house, the two of them sharing the same bed Rachel had slept in as a teenager, while I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold before I'd finished half of it, making a list of exactly what needed to happen next. I called Diane Pierce at 9 o'clock that morning. I'd known Diane for almost 15 years, ever since she'd handled my late husband's estate after his cancer diagnosis. She'd since built reputation across Richmond as one of the sharpest family law attorneys in the state, with a particular specialty in domestic violence cases that I now understood, with a clarity I wished I'd never needed, exactly why we'd need. "Maggie," she said, once I'd explained the basics, "I'm so sorry. I want you to know, before we go any further, that what you did last night, calling 911 immediately, getting Rachel and Sophie out, not letting anyone talk you into smoothing this over, that's exactly right. That's the foundation everything else gets built on. A lot of families don't get that part right, and it costs them everything later. I'm not interested in this just blowing over in 6 months with a plea deal and a stern warning," I told her. "I want this documented so thoroughly that there's no version of this where he walks away from it with his life intact." "Then let's build that," Diane said, and I could hear something shift in her voice, the particular focus of someone who'd clearly been waiting a long time for a client ready to actually fight properly, instead of quietly accepting whatever the system offered first. "First thing, I need you to tell me honestly, is this the first incident, or has this happened before?" I thought about the bruise on Rachel's forearm at Christmas years earlier. I thought about Lauren, the college roommate who'd simply disappeared from Rachel's life. I thought about a kitchen conversation about whether I'd left her father soon enough. "I don't know for certain," I admitted. "But I don't think it's the first time. I think it's just the first time anyone outside that house found out. That's actually important information, Diane said. If there's a pattern, even one we have to carefully establish rather than prove with hard evidence from years ago, it changes how aggressively we can move on a protective order, and it changes the conversation with the prosecutor's office about what charges actually get pursued. Over the following days, I became something I hadn't been in years, relentlessly organized, the same way I used to be running a trauma bay during a mass casualty event, except now the emergency was my own family. I drove Rachel to the hospital myself that first morning, not for treatment exactly, but for documentation. Photographs, a formal medical record, the kind of careful clinical evidence I knew from 26 years of experience, would matter enormously later, even when it felt, in the moment, like an almost unbearable thing to ask my daughter to sit through. I sat with Sophie and a gentle child psychologist Diane recommended, someone experienced in exactly this kind of case, who helped Sophie put into careful, age-appropriate words everything she'd witnessed over the years. Not just that one night, but the pattern underneath it, the things a 10-year-old notices and absorbs even when no adult ever explains them to her directly. I helped Rachel apply for an emergency protective order, sitting beside her at the courthouse while she answered questions from a judge that no 35-year-old should ever have to answer about her own marriage, holding her hand under the table the entire time, the same way I'd held it on that living room couch. And quietly, carefully, I started something else entirely. Something Diane mentioned almost in passing, then watched me seize onto with an intensity that clearly surprised even her. Brad works in finance, you said. Wealth management specifically? Senior advisor at Callaway Whitman, I confirmed. He manages money for some fairly prominent families in the Richmond area. Diane was quiet for a moment. You understand that a domestic violence arrest combined with an active protective order is the kind of thing that firm's compliance department is going to take very seriously, especially with high net worth clients who care a great deal about reputation. That's not something we have to manufacture, Maggie. That's just what happens when the truth becomes official record instead of a private secret. I thought about 8 years of dinner parties, of charming toasts, of a man who had built an entire comfortable, well-respected life on the careful, patient belief that no one outside that beautiful house with the wraparound porch would ever truly see what was happening inside it. Good, I said. Then let's make sure the truth becomes very, very official. The compliance department at Callaway Whitman moved faster than even Diane expected. It started with a phone call about 10 days after the arrest from a senior partner Brad had worked under for almost a decade. A call Brad later told Rachel, in one of the increasingly desperate voicemails he left her in those first few weeks, had lasted less than 4 minutes. The firm's policy, it turned out, was unambiguous when it came to advisors managing significant client wealth. An active criminal charge involving domestic violence, combined with a protective order now part of the public court record, triggered an immediate internal review. Not because the firm cared, particularly, about justice in the abstract, but because half their client base were exactly the kind of image-conscious, reputation-sensitive families who would not want their money managed by a man currently facing those charges, regardless of how the case eventually resolved. Brad was placed on unpaid administrative leave within the week. 2 weeks after that, once word had quietly made its way through Richmond's tightly knit financial circles, the way these things always do, regardless of how carefully anyone tries to contain them. 3 of his largest individual clients formally requested their accounts be reassigned to a different advisor. By the 6-week mark, the firm terminated his employment outright, citing, in language Diane later obtained through the divorce discovery process, conduct inconsistent with the firm's standards, and a material risk to client relationships. I won't pretend I felt nothing but clean satisfaction watching that unfold. I want to be honest about the complicated shape of it. There was a part of me, the part that had spent 6 years quietly explaining away 100 small warning signs, that took a fierce, unapologetic kind of relief in watching the comfortable life Brad had built so carefully begin to come apart at its actual, deserved seams. But there was another part of me, sitting in my kitchen reading through Diane's case updates, that simply felt exhausted. The particular exhaustion of understanding that none of this should have ever needed to happen in the first place. If any of us had looked closely enough, soon enough. Brad's reaction as the weeks went on followed a pattern Diane told me she'd seen play out almost identically in dozens of similar cases. First came the wounded calls to Rachel, full of promises and explanations and increasingly specific blame redirected back onto her. "You're the one who's destroying this family. You're the one who called your mother instead of talking to me. You're the one turning Sophie against me." When those calls stopped working, because Rachel, for the first time in 8 years, simply stopped answering them, the tone shifted into something colder, more strategic. Calls to mutual friends, carefully worded social media posts about co-parenting struggles and being unfairly judged. An attempt, transparent to anyone actually paying attention, to rebuild the same charming, reasonable public image that had fooled all of us for so long. It worked on a few people. I won't pretend otherwise. A handful of mutual friends quietly distanced themselves from Rachel during those weeks, uncertain who to believe, more comfortable simply stepping back from the entire situation than choosing a side. That stung Rachel more than almost anything else in those early months. Watching people she'd considered close friends decide that neutrality was easier than loyalty. But it didn't work on the people who actually mattered. Sophie's teacher, learning quietly through the school counselor what had happened, reached out personally to make sure Sophie had extra support during the transition. Diane's careful documentation, the medical records, Sophie's statement, the pattern of isolated friendships, Rachel slowly began reconstructing as she felt safe enough to reach back out to people like Lauren. Built a case file that left almost no room for the charming, reasonable version of events Brad kept trying to perform for anyone still willing to listen. There was one afternoon, about 2 months in, when Rachel came to me in my kitchen, phone in her hand, looking somewhere between furious and heartbroken. "He just posted something," she said quietly, "about how hard it is being separated from his daughter right now. People are commenting things like sending love and stay strong, Brad." I set down the dish towel I was holding and looked at my daughter for a long moment. "Let them comment," I said. "Let him post whatever he wants. None of that changes a single word in the police report, or the medical records, or what Sophie told that psychologist. The truth doesn't need an audience to still be true, Rachel. It just needs time." She nodded slowly, setting her phone face down on the counter, and for the first time since that night, I watched something in her posture straighten just slightly. Not fully healed yet, not even close, but no longer quite as small as the version of my daughter I'd watched make herself for 6 quiet years. The divorce and custody proceedings stretched across nearly 8 months, longer than any of us wanted. But Diane had warned us from the very beginning that thoroughness mattered more than speed. "We have one real shot at building a record that protects Sophie for the rest of her childhood," she told Rachel and me, sittings in her office one afternoon in early spring. "I'd rather take an extra few months and get it right than rush this and leave any opening for him to relitigate custody in 2 years." Brad's attorney, a sharp, well-paid litigator his parents had apparently helped fund, since his own finances had taken a considerable hit since the firm let him go, tried several approaches over those months. There was an attempt to paint the entire arrest as a one-time argument that escalated, conveniently leaving out the protective order, the medical documentation, and Sophie's careful, detailed statement to the child psychologist about years of tension she'd absorbed long before that particular night. There was an attempt to argue that Rachel and I had coached Sophie's account, an accusation Diane dismantled almost effortlessly by pointing out that the psychologist conducting the interview was independently appointed by the court, with no connection to either side. There was, near the end, an attempt at something almost worse. A sudden, dramatic show of remorse, a request for supervised visitation paired with mandatory counseling, framed by Brad's attorney as evidence of genuine accountability and growth. I watched Rachel sit through that hearing with a steadiness that made me prouder of her than almost anything I'd witnessed in her entire life. When the judge asked if she wanted to respond to Brad's stated willingness to attend counseling, she stood, steady-voiced, and said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. I spent 8 years hoping counseling, or a good week, or an apology would fix what was happening in my house, she said. I'm not interested in giving my daughter 8 more years of hoping the same thing. I'm asking this court to protect her now, based on what's already documented, not based on promises he's making for the first time only after losing everything else. The judge granted Rachel primary physical custody, with Brad's visitation limited to supervised sessions pending a court-ordered evaluation, a process that, 18 months later, was still ongoing, still supervised, still a long way from the unrestricted access Brad had clearly assumed. Walking into that house 8 months earlier, he would always simply be entitled to. The financial settlement was, by any measure, brutal for Brad, not out of vindictiveness. Diane was careful to remind us repeatedly, but simply because the math worked out that way once you accounted for a job loss directly tied to his own documented conduct, a significant payout to Rachel reflecting both equitable distribution and the financial harm caused by years of what the court's own findings ultimately termed a pattern of coercive control, and substantial child support calculated against his last verified income, regardless of how dramatically that income had since collapsed. He kept almost nothing of the comfortable life he'd built. The house with the wraparound porch was sold, the proceeds split according to the settlement, with the larger share going to Rachel in recognition of the down payment that had originally come from her own savings, years before Brad's name was ever on the deed. His professional reputation in Richmond's financial circles, once so carefully cultivated, never fully recovered. The kind of industry where reputation moves faster and lingers longer than almost any official record. I sat in that courtroom on the final day, watching the man who'd given a tearful, beautiful toast at my daughter's wedding 8 years earlier sign documents that dismantled almost everything he'd built since. And I felt, for the first time since that 214A, phone call, something close to a complete exhale. It wasn't triumph, exactly. I want to be honest about that distinction, because I think it matters. It was simply the particular, hard-won relief of watching a system, slow, imperfect, exhausting as it was, finally do the thing it was supposed to do, because 3 generations of women in my family had refused, for the first time in far too long, to quietly explain anything away. I think about that 2:14 a.m. phone call often, even now, more than a year removed from it. Not with the sharp panic I felt that night, but with something quieter. A kind of grateful disbelief that my granddaughter, at 10 years old, already understood something it took her own grandmother 66 years and a lifetime of clinical training to fully act on. That when something is wrong, you don't wait for someone else to notice it for you. I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about how this happens in so many families across this country, not just mine. We tend to imagine domestic violence as something loud and obvious, something that announces itself clearly enough that anyone watching closely would catch it immediately. The truth, I've learned, is so much quieter than that. It looks like a woman laughing a half-beat too quickly at her own expense. It looks like friendships that thin out gradually, explained away as just growing apart. It looks like a bruise on a forearm hidden under a sleeve with an explanation offered before anyone's even asked the question. It looks, most dangerously of all, like a perfectly respectable man at a dinner party, charming a room full of people who would never in 1,000 years imagine what happens once the door closes behind him at home. I was a trained professional. I'd spent 26 years learning to spot exactly this pattern in strangers, and it still took my own daughter being hurt, in her own home, in the middle of the night, before I let myself fully see what had been sitting in plain sight for 6 years. I don't say that to excuse myself. I say it because I think it's the single most important thing I want anyone listening to this to understand. If a trained nurse can talk herself out of trusting her own instincts about her own daughter for 6 years, then please don't assume you're somehow immune to doing the same thing in your own family. Trust the small, deniable moments. Trust the bruise with the explanation offered too quickly. Trust the friendships quietly disappearing. You don't need absolute proof to ask a hard question. You only need enough courage to ask it before someone you love has to call you at 2 a.m. to do it for you. I think, too, about Sophie, about an entire generation of children growing up far more aware than we give them credit for, absorbing patterns long before any adult sits them down to explain what those patterns mean. She didn't need anyone to teach her that closet door had to be locked. She figured that out entirely on her own, somewhere along the way, in a house none of the rest of us were watching closely enough. That's the part of this story that haunts me the most, if I'm honest. Not what Brad did to Rachel, devastating as that was. What it cost Sophie to grow up learning that lesson at all. What I've come to believe, more firmly than almost anything else in my life, is that protecting the people you love sometimes means refusing the comfortable explanation, even when the comfortable explanation is so much easier to live with. It means picking up the phone at 2 a.m. and moving before you've finished processing what you've just heard. It means sitting through 8 months of exhausting legal proceedings, instead of accepting whatever quiet settlement makes the discomfort end sooner. It means understanding that real protection isn't a single dramatic rescue. It's hundreds of small, deliberate choices made consistently by people who refuse to look away once they've finally let themselves see clearly. I got the chance to make those choices because my granddaughter was braver, at 10 years old, than I had been for 6 full years as her grandmother. I try, every single day since, to make sure I never need her to be that brave again. It's been a little over a year now since that phone call. Rachel and Sophie still live with me, for now. Not out of necessity anymore, but because, as Rachel told me a few months ago, sitting on my back porch with 2 cups of coffee between us, I'm not in any hurry to leave the first place that's actually felt safe in a long time, Mom. Rachel went back to school last fall, finally finishing that teaching certification Brad once laughed off at a dinner party as something she liked the idea of more than the reality. She started substitute teaching at Sophie's school this spring, and I watched my daughter walk into a building full of children with a kind of quiet confidence I hadn't seen in her in over 6 years. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. The particular steadiness of someone who's stopped making herself smaller to keep someone else comfortable. Sophie still sees a therapist twice a month, a kind, patient woman named Dr. Reyes, who Diane had originally recommended. She's doing well, by every measure that matters, back on her t-ball team, laughing easily again in a way that took longer to return than any of us expected. Sleeping with her bedroom door open now instead of locked, which her therapist tells us is, in its own small way, One of the clearest signs of healing we could ask for. Brad sees her every other weekend now. In a supervised setting, the visits gradually easing toward less restriction as he completes the court-mandated requirements. I don't know what kind of father he'll eventually become to her, long-term. I've made my peace with not controlling that part of the story. What I know for certain is that Sophie will grow up watching her mother and her grandmother model exactly what it looks like to refuse a comfortable lie once you've finally seen the truth clearly. And I have to believe that lesson will matter more, in the long run, than anything Brad does or doesn't manage to repair. I think about that 2:14 a.m. phone call almost every day, in some quiet corner of my mind, not with fear anymore, with something closer to gratitude. For 26 years of training that taught my hands to move before my heart had time to fully break, for a granddaughter brave enough to lock a closet door and dial my number instead of staying silent, and for a daughter strong enough, once given the smallest bit of safety, to stand up in a courtroom and refuse one more year of hoping things would simply get better on their own. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to carry with them, it's this. You don't need to have all the proof, or all the courage, or all the answers before you ask the hard question. You just need to ask it. The rest, painstakingly and imperfectly, tends to follow. And if you're sitting somewhere right now, recognizing some small piece of your own life in this story, a bruise explained too quickly, a friendship that quietly disappeared, a feeling you've spent years talking yourself out of, I hope you'll trust that feeling today a little more than I trusted mine for 6 long years. If this story meant something to you, stay close, hit subscribe if you're new here, and tell me in the comments. Has there ever been a moment in your own life where you wish you'd trusted your instincts sooner? I read every single comment, and if you or someone you love needs support, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available anytime at 1-800-799-7233.